In February 1940, President Roosevelt invited the delegates of the American Youth Congress to the White House. In his speech, Roosevelt addressed the fact that some of the youth organizations affiliated with the Youth Congress had been taken over by communists.
It has been said that some of you are communists. That is a very unpopular term today. The Soviet Union
Indeed, the Soviet Union had just made a pact with Nazi Germany and started a war with a neighboring country. And although a new wave of the Red Scare was already underway, Roosevelt's concern was justified. In 1935, a larger socialist student league, the SLID, and a smaller communist student league, the NSL, united to form a popular front organization called the American Student Union. Not long after the merger, the communists began removing moderate socialists from leadership positions. While the socialists were granted the more prestigious roles, communists established effective control of the organization behind the scenes. Although the unsuspecting socialists and liberals were numerically superior, they could not stop the disciplined and highly organized communist cadres. By 1939, the last non-communists had left the American Student Union, leaving the organization in the hands of communist leadership. Similar takeovers occurred in organizations such as the National Unemployed Council, the Psychologists League, and the American Artists Congress. Communists tried tirelessly to gain control of all kinds of organizations and institutions, particularly trade unions, with a unique strategy. In 1952, the sociologist Philip Selznick published an influential study of the organizational strategy of Bolshevik and Trotskyist parties, a strategy that distinguished them from socialist reformers and enabled them to gain control of organizations and institutions with relatively small groups of trained communist cadres. According to Selznick, this strategic approach constituted their primary method for acquiring power in advanced industrial societies. He termed this method the organizational weapon. For the purpose of this video, I use the terms socialists and social democrats to refer to left-wing reformers who accept the rules of constitutional democracy, while I use communists, Trotskyists and Bolsheviks for radical left-wing movements that reject the political arena of parliamentary democracy. I think this roughly corresponds to how Selznick uses the terms in his study. Of course, all of these labels have a long history and carry different meanings in different contexts. A constitutional order is a set of laws, rules, and conventions whose primary function is to make power responsible by limiting it and subjecting it to established procedures. In such an order, political authority is acquired through rule-based competition and exercised within defined constraints. Organizational practices become weapons when they are used without regard for these constitutional limits. Members of an organization may employ clandestine techniques to gain control while violating the norms that safeguard responsible power. For example, a group of friends within an organization may form a power clique. An official may alter technical decisions to advance policies that benefit allies and disadvantage opponents. Administrative reorganizations may be engineered to expand the influence of a particular bureaucratic unit. Political parties may mobilize their adherents for an ever wider set of tasks. Organizations with limited mandates, such as trade unions or civic associations, may extend their reach under the direction of an unaccountable leadership, or an official may secretly hire personnel to build a personal machine within the organization. In all these cases, organizational forms and practices become instruments for gaining power in ways that violate the constitutional order. Still, such isolated abuses are not unusual in democracies and rarely exceed their capacity for correction. Bolshevik practice, however, differs fundamentally from these sporadic cases of organizational misuse. Leninist actors do not infiltrate organizations merely to secure personal advantage. Rather, their efforts are coordinated, strategic, and often supported by an external state with the explicit aim of preparing for the seizure of power. What Leninists sought to overcome was not only anti-communist legislation or public sentiment, but the broader constitutional restraints that characterize democratic systems. The organizational weapon was designed precisely to subvert these restraints and to continue political struggle outside constitutionally grounded parliamentary competition where communists lost time and again to social democrats. Originally, Lenin developed the organizational weapon by combining the expectation of mass upheaval with the construction of a tightly disciplined party apparatus. Over time, however, party leaders recognized that they could not always rely on revolutionary mass movements. In democratic societies, the spread of communism required an enhanced and more sophisticated deployment of the organizational weapon, a method of disciplined infiltration, control and manipulation of institutions to achieve political dominance without mass uprisings. The core element of this strategy is the red cadre. A cadre originally referred to the permanent corps of military officers maintained in peacetime and around which a larger military force could be rapidly assembled when necessary. This disciplined and trained nucleus preserved organizational knowledge and professional experience. Such cadres enabled Prussia after its defeat by Napoleon and Germany after the First World War to rebuild professional armies relatively quickly and restore their military strength. Bolshevik cadres served a similar function in the political realm. They constituted a corps of professional, experienced and loyal revolutionaries. Membership in the Bolshevik Party was far more exclusive than membership in typical political parties. Its members underwent specialized training and were expected to function as professional revolutionaries. This did not mean that all cadres were full-time party officials, but rather that they were trained in political struggle, capable of leading mass constituencies, equipped with particular organizational skills, and personally committed to the party's objectives to the extent that they were willing to accept significant risks for themselves. A communist cadre is not shaped through ideological indoctrination alone. It is built through training, testing, and practical engagement in the struggle for political power. Cadre members inhabit a worldview defined by a continuous conflict. Wherever they are placed, there is always an institution to penetrate and control, and always an enemy to weaken or defeat. The Bolshevik cadre is the primary condition to transform a political party, which is a voluntary association, into an organizational weapon with deployable personnel. Simple members become agents. Our party, the Bolshevik leaders tell their ranks, is not like other parties. Georgy Dimitrov, the General Secretary of the Communist International, wrote that 4 qualities were required of communist cadres. First, absolute devotion to the cause of the working class, loyalty to the party, tested in the face of the enemy, in battle, in prison, in court. Second, closest possible contact with the masses. Third, ability independently to find one's bearings and not to be afraid of assuming responsibility and making decisions. Fourth, discipline and Bolshevik hardening in the struggle against the class enemy, as well as an irreconcilable opposition to all deviations from the Bolshevik line. As the last point already hints at, the organizational weapon was developed in the fight against the Tsarist regime and the Okhrana on the one side and non-Bolshevik leftists on the other. The proletariat has no other weapon in the fight for power except organization. The material unity of organization that welds together millions of toilers as the army of the proletariat. Although the archetype for the organization of communist cadres was the army, there are some crucial differences between a military cadre and the deployable personnel of the organizational weapon. Although the Bolsheviks were not opposed in principle to violence and assassination, and indeed organized waves of terror following the October coup, the organizational weapon itself bears little resemblance to physical violence or conventional military warfare. Red cadres in Western countries were sometimes involved in street fights with the police, fascist groups, and socialists, but they usually did not carry weapons or engage in military attacks. Their main weapons were discipline, ideology, and organization. The term organizational weapon refers to political combat conducted outside the rule-bound political arena of constitutional democracy. In ordinary political parties, most members provide only general consent, and only a small minority participates actively in meetings, protests, or organizational work. In this respect, conventional parties resemble other voluntary associations. By contrast, the combat party, conceived as an organizational weapon, requires the transformation of partial consent into total conformity. Achieving this transformation is not an easy task. First, new members must undergo ideological conditioning to convert the psychological motives for joining the party into full devotion to its mission. Second, although recruits may be attracted by ideological commitments, what the party ultimately requires is their development into technical skilled personnel who can be deployed as part of the organizational weapon. Third, the party must cultivate a unified consciousness, even though individuals typically maintain multiple competing loyalties. Military institutions achieve the total subordination of the soldier's life to military aims through legal authority and physical isolation. The combat party demands more. Political cadres must sever their prior attachments, achieve emotional readiness, and dedicate their entire lives to the cause. Members are psychologically isolated within a distinct moral and intellectual world. The enemy is defined not merely as a political opponent, but as a comprehensive global system of evil. Personal contact with such enemies is prohibited. Cadres also engage in clandestine or illegal activities that help establish a conspiratorial atmosphere. The doctrine of class struggle presupposes a continuous war that may be visible or concealed, but never ceases. Cadres are organized into very small units embedded within a broader network, which makes it unlikely that any member is ever without assigned tasks. They are kept constantly occupied with meetings, demonstrations, organizational duties, literature distribution, and recruitment. This creates a persistent sense of meaningful engagement. To leave the party is not to withdraw from a voluntary association. It is to desert in the midst of battle. The consequences may include expulsion, social ostracism, economic boycott, and public defamation. In a voluntary association, such as a trade union, leaders must continuously secure the consent of the membership, which significantly constrains their decision-making authority. The Bolshevik Party, however, was organized in a way that minimized this limitation. Its internal structure was designed to maintain strict control in the hands of a disciplined leadership, the vanguard, rather than to reflect the fluctuating preferences of a broad membership base. Let's look at a mundane example of communist strategy to take over a trade union. Once the organization is infiltrated, the open and secret communist union members will eagerly seek strategically important positions. When they have gained enough control, they begin manipulating votes. For example, they might organize a meeting with a lengthy agenda and place key decisions at the very end. The meeting would start after work, as usual, but continue for many hours, sometimes until 1 o'clock in the morning. While most socialists treated the union as a voluntary association and had other responsibilities, the disciplined communists could wait. In addition, socialist speakers were shouted down by organized booing squads until they were exhausted. Once enough non-communist members have left, the communists will immediately call the vote. The vote counters, of course, are also secretly communist. At the end of the lengthy meeting, they then schedule a continuation meeting for the next morning when most union members are working or otherwise unavailable. Bolshevik party cadres might consolidate the vanguard, but to fulfill their revolutionary role, they had to establish a pathway to their source of power, the masses. Around the turn of the 20th century, the mass became an object of fascination for many sociologists and cultural theorists, and much has been written about it ever since. For the purposes of this video, a relatively simple definition will suffice. For the Bolsheviks, the essential characteristic of the mass was its manipulability. The mass is always the relevant mass, depending on the power goals of the party. It is defined not by sheer numbers, but by its susceptibility to ideological organization. The organizational strategy of the combat party serves its political objectives, yet it also follows its own internal logic. To realize the full potential of the organizational weapon and to secure effective control over the masses, several conditions must be met. I picked out 4 of them. access, neutralization, legitimacy, and dual centers of power.
Take next some instruments which often give the communists a certain advantage over non-communists. First, organization. It is a misnomer to think of the Communist Party as a political party in our sense. Actually, it is
To avoid
organized along
isolation
military
from the
lines.
sources of power, deployed party cadres must continually devise techniques to penetrate target groups and institutions. A central instrument in this effort is the manipulation of peripheral organizations. Peripheral organizations constitute a network of groups that operate around the Communist Party while often presenting themselves as non-ideological and independent. Examples include the John Reed Clubs, International Labor Defense, and the Friends of the Soviet Union, as well as captured organizations such as the already mentioned American Students' Union. These organizations were usually controlled by the party through an embedded organizational core composed of loyal non-party members or covered party members. Initially, their primary purpose was to maintain the loyalty of fellow travelers and, at times, to generate financial resources through theft or falsified bookkeeping. Over time, the party's use of these organizations evolved. In the second phase, they became tools for gaining access to the masses. In the third phase, once political power had been secured, they served as transmission bells, that is, devices for extending control over everyday life and shaping the behavior of entire populations in socialist countries. An example of a Phase II peripheral organization was the American League Against War and Fascism, founded in 1933 as a formally independent group with openly communist participation. In 1935, the party sought to capitalize on widespread anti-war sentiment. Georgy Dimitrov wrote, "We must penetrate among the pacifist masses and carry out the work of enlightenment among them, using forms of organization and action which are adapted to the level of consciousness of these masses." In response, communist members of the League ceased publicly identifying themselves as party members. The organization was renamed the American League for Peace and Democracy, and it soon became one of the most effective foreign agencies in the United States for disseminating Soviet propaganda. Its primary audience consisted of middle-class Americans receptive to abstract symbols of liberalism, which the communists used to obscure the organization's ideological orientation. Co-opted international organizations amplify this strategy by allowing communists to speak as if they represented broad constituencies. A party operative may deliver a pro-Soviet or anti-American speech in the name of world labor or international students. Communist members of international voluntary associations could also leverage their personal identities to claim representational authority. For example, speaking abroad as representatives of American youth or at home as a spokesperson for the peoples of Asia, even when they were virtually unknown to the groups they claimed to represent. Leninism rests on the belief that workers will not develop a revolutionary consciousness on their own. According to Lenin, workers naturally develop only what he called trade union consciousness, not true class consciousness. This is why they tend to support social democrats rather than revolutionary politics. Lenin argued, the blind unfolding of the labor movement can only lead to the permeation of that movement with a bourgeois ideology because the unconscious growth of the labor movement takes the form of trade unionism, and trade unionism signifies the mental enslavement of the workers to the bourgeoisie. According to Lenin, socialists are not simply political rivals. They are the ones who mislead workers and divert them from revolutionary communism. If we look at the history of Bolshevik attacks on opponents, we can see that their fiercest hostility is directed at social democrats and competing communist groups. There are several possible reasons for this. Communists and socialists share a common history, and some of their rivalry likely stems from attempts to present themselves as the true defenders of that legacy. Over time, personal and political grudges have also developed, and there is the old saying that heresy is worse than opposition. Yet these emotional reactions do not explain the magnitude and intensity of anti-socialist attacks. In reality, the focus on the non-Bolshevik left is actually quite rational and stems from objective concerns. The main enemy is the one capable of exposing the Bolshevik Party before the relevant public, its source of power. Above all, the labor movement and liberal public opinion. Bolsheviks also criticize capitalists and imperialists, but exposure and critique by pro-capitalist forces is not what they fear most. What genuinely threatens them is criticism from socialists who hold credibility among workers. The same logic applies to the hostility toward rival communist movements such as Trotskyism or Titoism. These groups are dangerous precisely because they might attract members from the party's own trained cadres, thereby weakening the organization from within. It's always necessary in interpreting communism to keep in mind the concrete conditions of political struggle and to avoid reliance on the logical implication of general Marxist principles. Only with this perspective in mind can we understand why communists consistently direct their most intense efforts against social democrats and competing communist factions, although they have similar ideologies. The idea of political cooperation between leftist movements was not the invention of Bolsheviks, but the ideological organization of the United Front was. After the Bolshevik-Menshevik split, the Bolsheviks focused on training cadres and only sporadically engaged in united actions with socialists. The faction inside the party advocating stronger cooperation with socialists came to be known as the rightists, while the leftists argued for isolating communists from socialists. The leftist position rejected any sincere united front and promoted strong efforts to separate the socialist masses from their leaders. Consequently, cooperation should be limited to appeals directed at the socialist base, circumventing socialist leaders and accompanied by aggressive attempts to win over the socialist rank and file. This did not mean, however, that the rightists supported a genuine united front. They also wanted to maintain a sharp division between socialists and communists and aimed to win over the socialist rank and file. Their position differed in that they supported broader, though time-limited, cooperation and favored using as little subversion and deception as possible. The rightist push for a broader united front was perceived as dangerous and controversial among European communist leaders. Most European communist parties had only recently been formed through splits from socialist parties, and they were therefore highly invested in drawing clear boundaries between themselves and the socialists. Around 1919, the rightist position gained more influence, largely because it enjoyed Lenin's support. The rightists successfully advocated for cooperative actions with socialists on specific issues at the congresses of the Comintern. However, by 1924, there was a decisive turn to the left, and previous United Front efforts were explained away as tactical deception. This leftist line was confirmed at the Sixth Congress in 1928 and ultimately proved disastrous. It incorporated the social fascism doctrine, which rested on a misreading of the historical situation. It drove a wedge between communists and the masses. Moreover, the leftist strategy of subversion had become an open secret. The Comintern's own publications, for example, openly outlined the tactic of loudly calling for unity while imposing impossible conditions on socialist leaders so that they would appear to be the ones rejecting cooperation. At the same time, the ultra-leftist period allowed the Bolsheviks to purge the last remnants of social democratic tradition from their party and to consolidate control over the Communist International. Although Western communist parties became more isolated during this phase, the Bolsheviks had by then established a totalitarian one-party state in the Soviet Union and firmly dominated the Comintern. From this new position of strength, they began to test their organizational strategies in a renewed United Front effort in Europe. Consequently, in 1934, Stalin shifted the party line to the right, a change that was formally confirmed at the Seventh Congress in 1935. From that point onward, the Bolsheviks no longer subverted coalitions primarily through the aggressive display of communist symbols, but through organizational means. The new policy went so far as to promote an anti-fascist People's Front that included communists, socialists, peasants, artisans, and even bourgeois elements. This sudden openness after a period of isolation and ideological radicalization within the communist parties created unprecedented opportunities for deception on both the ideological and organizational levels. The resulting strategy of unity was then further refined and applied to peripheral organizations in the United States. The organizational weapon was born. Advocacy of revolutions is socially legitimized if the right to revolt is accepted by the community. Communists are interested in creating such a political atmosphere. In the early stages of Leninism, the party focused primarily on creating cadres within the broader Marxist movement. They mainly spoke to already radicalized individuals and sought to build legitimacy within a very narrow internal arena. Once these cadres were established through struggles within the Marxist movement, the Bolsheviks began to turn their attention to questions of legitimacy in the wider public. I will skip here the power struggle in Russia after 1917 and the adaptations made to the organizational strategy in this context, and skip right to the Bolshevik activity during Stalin's rule. The organizational strategy had to be adapted to function within non-autocratic political systems, which required a greater emphasis on conspiratorial activity and less on openly revolutionary propaganda. In this context, Bolshevik secrecy was not only a response to repression, but also a deliberate strategy tailored to specific political environments. To gain public legitimacy, Bolsheviks increasingly sought to associate themselves with figures of prestige, even if those individuals were not sympathetic to communism. This explains some of the seemingly inconsistent policies of peripheral organizations, which often aligned with prominent individuals or movements to gain credibility. Communists also earned legitimacy through hard work. In any organization they aimed to influence, they were often the most dedicated volunteers, committee members, and active participants. In most voluntary associations, this level of commitment is enough to secure leadership positions. Their organizational skills, especially in coordinating strikes, protests, and other political actions, made them valuable members, even in groups where the majority opposed communism. Another strategy for gaining legitimacy was to present Stalinist communism as simply one end of a broader political spectrum. Bolsheviks claimed to support progressive liberal policies or social reforms of social democrats, but more intensely. In reality, there is no smooth continuum. Bolshevism represents a fundamental break from the principles of liberal democracy. Stalinists were opposed to separation of power, freedom of the press, and the rule of law. By framing Bolshevism as just another point on a political continuum, liberals often failed to recognize that it was ultimately a power-driven totalitarian movement. Anti-communists often make a similar mistake by indiscriminately attacking all left-wing movements, even conflating New Deal liberalism with communism. Class war is a continuous struggle that can only truly end with the victory of the working class. Revolution represents the final transfer of power from the oppressor class to the oppressed class. Lenin and Trotsky noted that this transfer requires historical preparation. Even before the final revolution, a transitional split of sovereignty must occur. This is not a stable division like the relationship between local and federal governments, but a contested and provisional division of sovereignty. One historical example of this is the Soviets in Russia, which were small councils operating independently of the Russian government and state institutions until the creation of the Soviet Union. Another example is a trade union that begins to exercise functions normally reserved for the state. If workers perceive that the government consistently favors employers over labor, the union may take on state-like responsibilities itself. Independent militias may be formed if local police are distrusted. Special first aid stations may be set up if hospitals are seen as neglecting union members, and so on. Such episodic, small-scale centers are not unusual in democracies and are not necessarily a serious threat. In the United States in the 1970s, many organizations exercised state-like functions, including policing, legal decision-making, healthcare, education, or welfare distribution. Examples include the Black Panther community patrols or feminist self-help clinics. Depending on their scale and function, the state typically decides whether to suppress, co-opt, or tolerate these centers. For Bolsheviks, however, these centers are more than just forms of resistance by marginalized groups. They are part of a transitional structure intended to facilitate the eventual transfer of power from the bourgeois state to a communist state. They represent the formation of a new state apparatus with the existing state acquiring influence and legitimacy before the final revolution. As the community becomes increasingly alienated from the political system, the government loses legitimacy while radical groups gain credibility. The history of the Soviets in the Soviet Union demonstrate that Bolsheviks view such centers not as ends in themselves, but as tools enabling the party's eventual monopoly on power. Stalinists developed methods to create a split in sovereignty without the spontaneous emergence of new social forms. When enough government agencies, institutions, and organizations are infiltrated and controlled by the combat party, a new state apparatus can be constructed to replace the old one. In this case, the split in sovereignty results from organized subversion rather than from the spontaneous formation of resistance centers by marginalized groups. Leninism was adapted so that the state does not have to be smashed by a coordinated insurrection and then rebuilt by a revolutionary regime. Instead, the existing state can be gradually overtaken by the organizational weapon without causing major social turmoil, mass uprisings, or the disintegration of old institutions. This improved version of the organizational weapon allows a relatively small but highly disciplined group to seize control of the state with minimal mass support. A clear example of a successful takeover using the organizational weapon is the 1948 coup in Czechoslovakia. From the outside, Czechoslovakia looked like a parliamentary democracy with relative freedom of the press and so on. Yet, in the background, Bolsheviks already took control. First, a united bloc of communist and non-communist parties was established to govern the parliament. However, this bloc was not a voluntary or temporary parliamentary alliance. It existed primarily to provide the Bolsheviks with legitimacy as part of a governing coalition. Withdrawal from the bloc was effectively blocked, while the Bolsheviks began filling key institutions such as security forces and media channels with loyalists. In the end, the coup took place without any spontaneous mass uprisings. Unlike the spontaneous Russian Soviets of 1917, the Czechoslovak organized action committees intended to legitimize the coup did not reflect mass upheaval, but rather a carefully planned seizure of power. There are different kinds of coups. The first is a straightforward military coup, which relies primarily on force. The second is Bonapartism, a military coup combined with claims to a popular mandate. The third type of coup depends on carefully prepared institutions, most importantly, a highly disciplined combat party. This form of coup can achieve total power by deeply penetrating the social fabric. Examples include the Nazi and Bolshevik takeovers. It relies on a combination of legal and illegal work. The party has one branch that operates openly within the law and a parallel underground organization. The Stalinist party adapted this third type of coup into a fourth kind, which depends almost entirely on an improved version of Lenin's organizational weapon that can work with very little support from spontaneous mass movements. So-called fellow travelers or Stalinoids were individuals who actively supported communists without being communists themselves. They formed the core of those influenced by peripheral organizations. In his study, Selznick offers a psychopolitical profile of the Stalinoid fellow traveler. Stalinoids were motivated more by alienation from existing values than by positive belief in communism. They sought substitutes for old convictions, but were generally unwilling to abandon their former lives completely or to fully commit to the communist cause. Emotionally, they reacted much more intensely to political issues than actual Bolsheviks, and were prone to utopian expectations, demanding immediate satisfaction rather than postponing gratification for long-term goals. Despite their high emotional engagement, they rarely committed themselves fully and always kept an exit route open. Fellow travelers usually participated, based on stereotyped political codes and symbols. Values are usually expressed in abstractions, such as democracy, the people, or justice, that actualize their meaning through democratic institutions. But disconnected from democratic procedures, they become free-floating ideological symbols that can absorb almost any content. Fellow travelers often displayed tolerance in superficial and ritualized ways, lacking the nuanced understanding and genuine empathy that make tolerance a meaningful value. As a result, they were often unable to distinguish between someone who is a committed anti-Semite or racist and someone whose behavior stems from cultural conditioning or predispositions. Fellow travelers were more admirers of power than wielders of it. They were easily impressed by the effectiveness of a totalitarian party or a dictator who can get things done and operates unrestrained by bourgeois values and democratic processes. Leninists offered two persuasive arguments for worshippers of power. First, that there is an irresistible historical trend towards a communist revolution, and second, that the success of the Leninist revolution represents history's approval of Leninism over all other revolutionary and reformist movements. Furthermore, the devaluation of means and the emptying out of moral ends often leads to double standards, for example when evaluating imperialism practiced by Western versus non-Western powers. Fellow travelers were easily persuaded by doctrinaire theories of imperialism that ignore the suffering caused under all forms of imperial rule. They were fighting for the civil liberties of Westerners, but had no problem when the same rights were being denied to the peoples of China and the Soviet Union. The ex-communist Eugene Lyons described the total capitulation to power shown by fellow travelers defending the Moscow show trials. He wrote, "The same editors and writers who once spoke up for Mooney, for Sacco and Vanzetti, who presumably cherished the memory of world response to Dreyfus or Mendel Baylis' case, now gave every benefit of doubt to an omnipotent state and its firing squad rather than to its victims." As you may have noticed, Selznick, well, to paraphrase Marx, he does not paint the fellow travelers in rosy colors. His assessment, however, is not very different from how the Bolsheviks themselves saw them. Leninists offered two of the most damning judgments a communist could make. They described fellow travelers as petty bourgeois and unable to think dialectically. Here, dialectical thinking refers to the ability to apply principles selectively, adapted to the urgencies of political struggle. Fellow travelers, by contrast, cling to rigid formulations that are emotionally satisfying but lack Leninist flexibility in action. Furthermore, they were described as fearful, hesitant, egoistic, and unreliable. Their motivation did not derive from class consciousness, but from an intellectual soul sickness and emotional needs. Professional Bolsheviks, on the other hand, derived security from devotion to the party and belief in the cause. They drew spiritual strength from the community, the single-mindedness of their work, and faith in historical materialism. In the eyes of the party, fellow travelers were always suspect and untrustworthy. Yet they remained useful because they provided access to the public that was often denied to Bolshevik agents. Overall, Stalinoid fellow travelers were drawn to totalitarianism in general, and their focus on communism was often somewhat arbitrary. Selznick even notes that many anti-communists also exhibit Stalinoid traits. Selznick concludes, "Under conditions of political combat, those who have no firm values of their own become the instruments of the values of others." Selznick identifies several tactics used by covert communists and fellow travelers to suppress anti-Soviet sentiment in the US. I picked out three of them: the suppression of anti-Soviet messages, the Informal Veto, and Slander. More effective than plain anti-communist propaganda movies are feature films about the victims of Bolshevism, the life of disillusioned communists, or satires on Marxism. US communists and their fellow travelers were usually not in a position to actively promote Soviet propaganda in Hollywood movies. Instead, they focused on using their influence to block or suppress anti-Soviet messages. A notable example is the Hollywood screenwriter Dalton Trumbo, who explained in 1946 in a communist newspaper that Soviet sympathizers like him were able to prevent the production of movies based on stories written by Trotskyists or disillusioned fellow travelers such as Arthur Koestler. Leftist and liberal organizations in the US were not indifferent to the events happening in the Soviet Union. Yet, whenever investigations or public statements were demanded regarding Soviet totalitarian actions, such as the Moscow show trials, the Lysenko affair, or the killing of anarchists in Spain, Soviet sympathizers would block or delay them without openly declaring allegiance to the Soviet Union. They often argued that there was insufficient information to make a judgment, or that such sensitive matters should not be discussed publicly because doing so could alienate workers and undermine the Popular Front, which would ultimately only benefit capitalists. From the very beginning, Bolsheviks often resorted to slander, social isolation, and character assassination. The communist David Sharp quoted Lenin's justification of psychological terror in his biography. "I purposely chose that tone, calculated to evoke in the hearer hatred, disgust, and contempt for the people who carry on such tactics. That tone, that formulation is not designed to convince, but to break the ranks, not to correct a mistake of the opponent, but to annihilate him, to wipe him off the face of the earth. Indeed, that approach evokes the worst thoughts and suspicions against the opponent and, it is true, instead of convincing and correcting, introduces confusion into the ranks of the working class. It is permissible and it is imperative to write in such a language about an organization that splits off. For Lenin, Mensheviks and other reformers were sworn enemies because they challenged the Bolsheviks' organizational strategies. Against them, such nasty tactics were considered imperative. Bolsheviks also employed calculated defamation within their organizations. It was especially effective when used by a tightly knit community against its own members. Deviators and skeptics within communist circles were socially isolated and publicly defamed. The constitution of the Communist American Party from 1938 explicitly forbade any political or personal contact with enemies of the party. Since participation in party activities required total dedication and full immersion in the community, isolated or expelled members were forced to reconstruct both their political and personal lives. Selznick cites the case of a former member of a communist-controlled union. After she opposed the election of a candidate supported by the party, she was socially isolated and subjected to malicious gossip. She was labeled an enemy of the working class, an emotionally unstable woman, and a sexual pervert. The mere threat of defamation was also highly effective. Many disillusioned communists remained silent after losing their faith in Stalinism to avoid similar treatment.
The leaders of the auto workers are young, tough, committed. Some of them, it is true, are communists, but most are not, and the communists will be driven out of the Union later. Now, secretly...
In his study, Selznick identifies a number of measures through which organizations and institutions may resist communist infiltration and takeover. He argues that too much attention is often paid to the simple fact that Bolsheviks are present in an organization. Their mere membership is not particularly dangerous. What matters is the influence they wield, the willingness of non-communist members to collaborate with them, and the extent to which the infiltrators can use the organization to conceal conspiratorial activities. Similarly, a united front does not have to end with Bolsheviks taking over control of mass organizations as long as the socialists are aware of the threat and willing to act. Each institution should be defended on its own terms. Elites with access to the masses should be supported to channel popular resentment through constitutional channels. Another important element of a defensive strategy is the denial of legitimacy and the restriction of access. However, communists should only be politically isolated, not formally excluded from membership in unions or other organizations. Many anti-communist strategies inadvertently strengthen rather than weaken the Bolsheviks. This often stems from a failure to recognize that political combat requires situational judgment. Intimidation and coercion are often applied inappropriately, undermining basic civil rights. and direct interference in the internal affairs of organizations is often counterproductive. Since the goal is the defense of certain values, not simply the power of an elite, the weapons used against subversion must be fashioned as to preserve these values in the cause of their defense. Opposition to Bolshevik subversion is most effective when it comes from within an infiltrated organization and engages communists on their own terms. Non-communists should also recognize the important difference between socialists and communists. Bolsheviks in a constitutional democracy like to portray themselves as one end of a continuum of political opinions, while the reality in the Soviet Union shows that they do not see civil liberties, free press, and so on as desirable goals. Sections of the population that are insufficiently represented by organizations and institutions that foster their values and defend their interests, such as the unemployed or the youth in the 1950s, are particularly vulnerable to capture by communist organizations. Ironically, in this respect, workers were among the most resilient groups against Bolshevik propaganda. The reformist left is vulnerable to Bolshevik infiltration when it fails to account for the threat posed by Stalinists and when it lacks strong institutional roots. After a brief period of weakness following the Second World War, however, labor movements in Western countries regained strength and fought their way to legitimacy. First-hand experience with Bolsheviks, for example during the Spanish Civil War, made them acutely aware of the threat of Stalinism. Selznick also notes that employers who attempt to gain strong control over trade unions often weaken their leadership, making the unions more vulnerable to communist pressure from below. The two main sources of strength of the communists are the power of the Soviet state and the fractures within target societies. Selznick warns that the measures listed here may help to counter communist subversion, but long-term economic and political stability is ultimately decisive. The original organizational strategies of the Bolshevik Combat Party were successful in that they allowed the party to take over the largest land empire in the world. However, if we measure their success against their stated goals, they largely failed. The Bolsheviks were not able to seize power in a single Western country. Takeovers orchestrated through the organizational weapon, such as in Czechoslovakia, occurred only within the context of the Eastern Bloc. A major problem for peripheral organizations was the Leninist flexibility of Soviet policy. All peripheral organizations faced crises in 1939 and 1940 when the Soviet Union signed a pact with Nazi Germany and then launched a war against Finland. These organizations were forced to shift positions repeatedly, first condemning fascism, then denouncing US support for the Allies as warmongering, and later supporting that same Allied effort. Many peripheral organizations had to be renamed multiple times, and keeping communists and fellow travelers abroad aligned with the changing policies proved challenging. When Selznick published his study in 1952, Stalin was still alive, and McCarthyism was casting a shadow over the United States. Against this backdrop, he produced a sober analysis of Bolshevik strategies in Western countries. Studies like Selznick's influenced measures aimed at countering Bolshevik and Trotskyist subversion. However, his advice to deploy defensive methods cautiously came too late and largely fell on deaf ears. Broad and often counterproductive measures, such as the blacklisting of Hollywood writers, were implemented. Anti-communist propaganda flooded the US and created an atmosphere of hysteria. Racists exploited the widespread anti-communist sentiment to advance their own agendas, while elites used it to suppress workers' movements. Although Selznick's study focused on communism, he noted in the footnotes that anti-communist forces could also erode the values of democratic societies. He cited the example of American universities that were able to resist communist subversion but were not strong enough to withstand the pseudo-conservatism of anti-communist forces, which also undermined academic values. Selznick's general methods bear some resemblance to neo-institutionalist sociology, which became quite prominent in the 1970s and 80s, while his psychological profile of fellow travelers draws on mass psychology. This comes with a strong focus on elites, institutions, values, and leadership, and, in general, a certain elitist conservatism. However, unlike earlier forms of institutionalist sociology, Selznick acknowledges that not every institution deserves preservation simply because it exists, and conserving an institution often requires transforming it to ensure it can adapt to changing circumstances. It won't come as a surprise that large portions of a sociological study written over 70 years ago are outdated. Yet there's also little that can be entirely dismissed. Both the sociological and psychological frameworks reflect their time, with their narrow focus on elites and reliance on older psychological models. Contemporary sociologists would likely adopt different frameworks, given societal changes and advances in sociological and psychological knowledge. One outdated aspect of Selznick's study, I think, is his psychological profile of fellow travelers. While some elements might still hold if the analysis were revisited today, the studies that he relied on no longer meet contemporary scientific standards, and the profile he presents is overly simplistic. For example, many fellow travelers, I would argue, did not fully commit to communism simply because they were not communists, rather than out of cowardice. Communists did not invent the desires for peace, workers' rights, or the end of apartheid. These concerns originated within Western societies. They merely sought to manipulate them for their own advantage. The motives of fellow travelers were sometimes complex and at other times strikingly simple, as in the case of writers and journalists who were seduced by the promise of the Communist Party to support the publication of their work. Nonetheless, Selznick's study remains a valuable analysis of Leninist, Stalinist, and Trotskyist organizational strategies during the Cold War. Despite its weaknesses, it stands out amid the turbulence of the Red Scare and continues to offer important historical insights into the core practices of communist organization.